Serge Diaghilev, one of the most influential artistic figures of the 20th century, failed miserably as an artist. He failed as a musician, as a singer, and as a composer. But he had one great strength. Diaghilev knew who he was.
I am at first a charlatan, but full of dash. Secondly, a great charmer. Thirdly, cheeky. Fourthly, a very reasonable man with few scruples. Fifthly, someone afflicted, it seems, with a complete absence of talent. And yet, I think I have found my true vocation, to be a patron of the arts.
Serge Diaghilev cajoled and bullied, but he was also engaging. One of his targets remarked that he could charm a corpse. He courted avant-garde painters, Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, dancers, Václav Nijinsky and Anna Pavlova, and composers, Igor Stravinsky and Sergei Prokofiev. And they stepped beyond the boundaries of their individual art forms and into the service of the Ballets Russes, fusing the latest in art, music and dance in spectacles that astonished audiences. Diaghilev's promotion of the Ballets Russes knew no boundaries. For 20 years he managed the company, often on a shoestring, like a more or less benevolent despot. Only one unauthorized 30-second film clip of his dancers exists, an outdoor rehearsal of Les Sylphides in the Swiss resort of Montreux. Diaghilev refused to allow his productions to be filmed to protect theatrical box office earnings. Serge Diaghilev's company dominated the ballet stages of the world from 1909 to 1929. Its costumes were as carefully preserved as treasures, and its innovative choreography has been painstakingly studied and reconstructed for dance troupes around the world. Diaghilev's life began in 1872 in Nizhny, in the Russian province of Novgorod. His mother died 3 months after his birth. His father, a cavalry officer, remarried 2 years later. Serge adored his stepmother, Yelena. Cultured and musical, she attracted poets, playwrights and musicians to the Diaghilev's house in the small city of Perm, where Serge spent his teenage years. They performed concerts, operas and plays for guests. His school friends referred to the family home as the Athens of Perm. The Diaghilev's lifestyle was cushioned by their monopoly on local vodka production granted by the Tsar. They kept an apartment in St. Petersburg and occasionally traveled to Paris. But Western notions of democracy and capitalism were slowly drifting into Tsarist Russia. Monopolies gave way to free markets, decimating the Diaghilev fortune. Shortly after Serge began law studies at St. Petersburg University in 1890, his father declared bankruptcy. The student, aged 18, made do with a bequest from his mother's estate and support from her relatives in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg offered its educated classes a rich cultural calendar. Alexander Borodin's opera Prince Igor and Tchaikovsky's ballet Sleeping Beauty both premiered in Diaghilev's first year in the city. The Mariinsky Theatre was home to the Imperial Opera and Ballet companies. Diaghilev became an ardent champion of the composer Richard Wagner's aesthetic agenda, fusing music, art, design, and performance to create a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art. Diaghilev abandoned any thought of a career in law. His occasional visits to Western Europe had revealed profound changes taking place in contemporary art. Energized, Diaghilev and the artist Alexandre Benoit founded Russia's first modern art journal. Mir ist Kustva, World of Art, published its first issue in 1898. Diaghilev and Benoit championed the contemporary European art that was beginning to influence young artists in Russia. They also argued for the revival of traditional Russian arts and crafts. The journal attracted many artists, including Leon Bakst, who had studied in Paris, and Nicholas Roerich. Like Benoit, they would become designers for the Ballets Russes. Mir Iskustva made a splash, but the journal, expensive to produce, folded in 1904. Diaghilev concentrated his energies on a mammoth exhibition of Russian historical portraits at the Tauride Palace. Opened by Tsar Nicholas II in March of 1905, it was hailed as a success. Diaghilev's reputation was secure. Russia was less fortunate. The imperial fleet, at anchor off the coast of Manchuria, suffered a surprise attack by the Japanese in April of 1904. The Russo-Japanese War began, ending in a disastrous Russian defeat. Russia's weaknesses were laid bare: nepotism, an antiquated infrastructure, and debilitating poverty. Protests erupted. The Tsar's response was a violent attack on protesters in 1905, known as Bloody Sunday. Hundreds of protesters in St. Petersburg were killed or wounded. Artists, including the dancers of the Imperial Ballet, went on strike in support of the workers. Russia's disastrous defeat by Japan and the social unrest at home depleted the imperial treasury. With the economy in shambles, the Tsar desperately needed loans from France. To improve Franco-Russian relations, he supported events promoting Russian culture in Paris. In 1906, the Tsar supported Serge Diaghilev's exhibition that surveyed 200 years of Russian painting and sculpture. It was shown as part of the annual Salon d'Automne, the high point of the Parisian art season. The Russian works were favorably received by a Parisian press. Diaghilev moved quickly to capitalize on its success.
He believed that he was part of a new Russian art movement. And I use the word art not just to refer to the visual arts, but also refer to Russian music, to Russian culture generally, to Russian theater, and that this was something he wanted to bring to the West.
In 1907, Diaghilev drew on his vast knowledge of Russian music to organize a concert series in Paris. It succeeded. Diaghilev knew that French audiences responded to the primitive and exotic in works by Paul Gauguin and Henri Rousseau, and he speculated that they might be intrigued by what they considered the exoticism of Russian music, art, and dance. In 1908, he returned with the opera Boris Godunov. The melodramatic Russian tale of murder and intrigue opened at the Paris Opera House, and Diaghilev had a star to promote it. Diaghilev persuaded Fyodor Chaliapin, the finest operatic bass of his generation, to sing the lead. Chaliapin's costume was an intricate composition of silk and metal thread, glass beads, pearls, and fur that evoked the exoticism of Russia's medieval past. French audiences were captivated.
They liked fantasy, they liked something exotic, something from another world. And it obviously proved a prime focus not only for orchestral works and vocal works, but certainly for ballet.
Diaghilev returned the following year with a new trick up his sleeve. In a letter to Benoit, Diaghilev noted,
"From opera to ballet is but a step. There are more than 400 ballet dancers on the rosters of the imperial theaters. I couldn't help observing that there was a reaction against the classical tradition among the younger members. I began to wonder if it would be possible to create new, short ballets, which would link music, art, and choreography together more closely than ever before."
In the spring of 1909, the choreographer and dancer Michel Fokine, designer Leon Bakst, and more than 70 dancers on their summer break from the Imperial Ballet, including Václav Nijinsky, joined Diaghilev in Paris. The company embodied the spirit of a new and restless Russia.
I think what was driving the restlessness was that Russia itself was restless. And these are people that came out of that kind of environment. What did this mean? It meant that they were questioning, as no one before had questioned, the entire hierarchical structure and the ways in which the court and ballet and Russia itself was being run.
Anna Pavlova was among the dancers who questioned the rigidity of the Imperial Ballet's choreography.
I have attempted to throw a spiritual veil of poetry over the matter-of-fact aspects of dancing to screen the mechanical elements. I often extemporize. I borrow from the palette of choreography any color which suits my fancy.
Michel Fokine was also alert to the changing cultural climate. The naturalism emerging in the productions by Konstantin Stanislavski at the Moscow Art Theatre intrigued Fokine.
He was doubting the tradition that he came from. And he started to say, why are we making ballets about these princesses and princes? And why don't we make ballets that look like regular people? Why don't we make ballets that look like the way artists are portraying the human figure in painting? How can we try to bring a kind of naturalism into dance?
Fokine's questions continued. Why were male dancers limited to parts in which they were either supporting ballerinas or consigned to character parts? Why was the emphasis more on footwork than dance movements that involved the whole body? Were precise geometric configurations for the dancers the only way to stage ballets? His answers would change ballet forever. Diaghilev and Fokine were also aware of a new and more free-flowing style of dance coming from the United States. Loie Fuller dazzled Parisian audiences in the early 1890s. Impersonators recreated her exuberant style of dancing and carefully coordinated lighting effects. Fuller was followed by Isadora Duncan. Spurred by improvisation, she used her entire body to express feelings and emotional states. Her barefoot St. Petersburg performances in 1904 outraged traditionalists, but fascinated Fokine. In 1909, Diaghilev presented a season of Russian ballet at the Châtelet Theatre in Paris to thunderous applause. Fokine presented dances by the Polovtsian warriors excerpted from Borodin's opera Prince Igor, a tale of 12th century warfare on the Russian steppes. Audiences accustomed to French ballet were electrified by the raw energy and power of the Russian dancers. The designs by Nicholas Roerich reflected his interest in ethnography and the folk arts and crafts of Central Asia. The costumes bombarded viewers with bold colors and dazzling optical effects. They were made of shimmering silks from Uzbekistan, purchased by Roerich in St. Petersburg markets. The ballet appealed to Western audiences' appetite for the exotic, an appetite fueled by The much-publicized debut of Anna Pavlova with the Ballets Russes came in 1909. She starred in a performance of Les Sylphides with music by Frédéric Chopin. The ballet had no plot. It relied purely on the marriage of dance and music. The first season was an artistic success. The poet Anna de Noailles declared,
It was as if creation, having stopped on the seventh day, now, all of a sudden, resumed. Something completely new in the world of arts. The phenomenon of the Ballets Russes.
For the 1910 season, Diaghilev sought to capitalize on the previous year's success. When the Tsar withdrew his financial support, the impresario courted arbiters of taste, including Monsieur Certes and other Parisian patrons. A gifted concert pianist, Monsieur sat for many of the leading painters of her day. She had married both well and often. She would support Diaghilev's productions for the remainder of his life. The Princesse de Polignac, the American-born Winneretta singer, heiress to the singer's sewing machine fortune, also contributed to Diaghilev's Paris seasons for years. Diaghilev knew how to raise money. He also had a flair for publicity. Scheherazade opened in June of 1910. On the first night, the sensuous tale of wanton pleasures in a harem set to music by Rimsky-Korsakov created a frenzy. For the sets, Bakst drew on a long tradition of Orientalist fantasy that pervaded all the arts. The ballet's eroticism was heightened to the point of sensationalism by Fokine and his dancers and their costumes.
Diaghilev's costumes were very early on recognized as something new. They were new in the sense that they clearly were not conventional ballet costumes. In Scheherazade, you were wearing harem pants and some sort of top that was probably free-flowing and which allowed your middle to be much more expressive than if you were in a tutu, and tutus, remember at that point, were still quite heavily corseted.
The diaphanous, lushly colored costumes designed by Bakst combined blatant and scandalous sexuality with an elegance shrewdly promoted in publicity photos for years. A Scheherazade craze swept through Paris and the rest of Europe. Paul Poiret, known as the King of Fashion, created Oriental-style haute couture. Turbans and harem pants came into vogue. Women wore Scheherazade-influenced outfits to Scheherazade theme parties. Scheherazade's star was the prodigy Václav Nijinsky. The child of Polish dancers, Nijinsky and his sister Bronislava Nijinska had trained under Fokine. Nijinsky had met Diaghilev in St. Petersburg, where the two became intimate. Nijinsky combined extraordinary strength and athleticism with unusual expressiveness.
He was 5'4", not a big prince-like guy. He had a very long, thick neck. He had a very long body and actually pretty stubby legs, short, but very thick. His suits had to be tailored because his thighs were so big. So this is a kind of body that scaled in a way for modernism, for primitive, for moving away and breaking the bounds of the tradition that he had come out of.
His performance electrified the audience in the opening at the Paris Opera. For the next 4 years, he would come to symbolize the Ballets Russes, playing princes, puppets, slaves and fawns. A contemporary noted,
"He is like a butterfly, but at the same time, he is the epitome of manliness and youthful beauty. The ballerinas, who are just as beautiful, are completely eclipsed by him."
3 weeks after Scheherazade, the company opened Firebird. an amalgamation of Russian folk tales. A mythic bird gives the Tsar's son a magical feather, allowing him to defeat a demon. With Tamara Kasavina's performance, another star was added to Diaghilev's ensemble. Firebird also marked the beginning of Diaghilev's collaboration with Igor Stravinsky.
When he commissioned Firebird from Stravinsky, he asked for a real Russian ballet. And what did he mean by that? He really meant that he needed something that sounded Eastern and exotic, but also contained the Western tradition, which, after all, is what Russia had at that time. It had this kind of tension and conflict between its Western-leaning roots and its Eastern Slavic orientation.
Stravinsky turned his back on the prevailing taste for overripe romanticism. The French composer Claude Debussy attended the premiere. He declared,
"The music is not the docile slave of the dance. You hear completely unfamiliar rhythmic combinations. French dancers would never have agreed to such music. Diaghilev is a great man, and Nijinsky is his prophet."
The final triumph of the season came in July with the premiere of Petrushka. Stravinsky and Alexandre Benoit wrote the libretto, setting it at an annual fair held in St. Petersburg. The Moor, the ballerina, and Petrushka are all puppets who are brought to life by a magician. A romantic triangle between them ends tragically when the ballerina chooses the Moor, devastating Petrushka.
Stravinsky, coming off Firebird, which was much in the mold of Rimsky-Korsakov, tells his story using dissonance in a way that hadn't been used before. That crunching dissonance really is what helped put Petrushka on the map, that something new and different had occurred.
Petrushka's staging also introduced a new modernism into the Ballets Russes.
I know from studying it and from working on it that Fokine and Stravinsky and Diaghilev were interested in Stanislavski and what he was doing in Moscow at that time, and they were trying to bring realism to theater. The crowd scenes, they weren't doing the old-fashioned opera acting or ballet acting. They were actually really trying to bring realism into those crowd scenes. And that really is, I think, amazing. The Stravinsky score can stand alone. The choreography can stand alone. Benoit's costumes and set, evoking the 1830s in St. Petersburg, all of that can stand alone. But when they come together, I think it's magical theater.
The role of Petrushka was danced by Rudolf Nureyev in a recreation by the Joffrey Ballet in 1981. Petrushka was one of Nijinsky's great triumphs, permitting him to exploit his gift for mime as well as his mastery of Fokine's challenging choreography. The role literally followed Nijinsky to his grave, where a statue depicts him in the role of the tragic puppet. Narcissus, choreographed by Fokine, and Nijinsky's sister Bronislava Nijinska, premiered in the 1911 Paris season. The costumes were designed by Bakst. He made drawings that captured a vision of how the costumes would be seen in motion on stage. Flowing images that emphasized the ballet's expressive choreography. Nijinsky starred in The Blue God, an adaptation of a Hindu legend that premiered in 1912. The costumes were inspired by Hindu and Buddhist motifs, including a lotus on the bodice. For a young god, Bakst also designed a headdress with multiple heads, recalling the carved Buddhas on a 12th century Cambodian temple. Afternoon of a Faun, inspired by a poem by Stéphane Mallarmé, was first staged in Paris in 1912. The story was simple. A lecherous faun in pursuit of coy nymphs. They escape, and he satisfies himself with a forgotten scarf. Despite its ancient setting, it was a thoroughly modern ballet. Bakst designed the sets and costumes. Nijinsky danced the principal role. The score was written by Claude Debussy.
Claude Debussy changed not only the face of French music, but music in the world. All of a sudden, the key relationships are remote. The melodies are not necessarily so singable. He moves us into a rhythmic world that the French hadn't encountered yet.
The work was a watershed for the Ballets Russes and for Nijinsky as a choreographer.
He insisted on showing the dancers exactly where they should look, exactly how this stance that their bodies would take. Nothing was really left to them. Nothing was left to chance.
Instead of virtuoso displays of physicality, Nijinsky created a highly restrained, precise, and angular choreography. According to sources close to Nijinsky, he based his character on figures he'd seen on ancient vases at the Louvre. He transformed the static imagery into stylized movements in tension with the rhythms of Debussy's score.
Nijinsky really invented a new kind of technique that he then went on to demand from his dancers. So that in something like Afternoon of a Faun, which we still have and know, the movements are turned in, they're down, they're low, they're not pretty, they're not gracious, they're not graceful. So the dancers were told, go up and come down flat-footed, or land like a goat. Not like a princess or a beautiful faun, but like a goat. So there's this kind of inward, interior, and very intensely physical, but compressed and restrained sort of movement that the dancers really chafed against. They complained bitterly.
Resentful of Diaghilev's promotion of Nijinsky, Fokine left the company 2 weeks later, just after Daphnis and Chloe. The ballet, inspired by an ancient Greek tale, opened in June of 1912. Bakst designed the costumes, flowing and soft for Chloe, bold geometric patterns and stridently colored tunics for the brigands who kidnap her. The set designs were an eye-boggling jumble of acid yellows, greens and blues. Critics compared the decor, an abstract landscape of cypresses, to landscape paintings by Cézanne and Gauguin. The most controversial ballet in the company's history opened in May of 1913. The Rite of Spring was described in the souvenir program as pictures of pagan Russia. Stravinsky's score revolutionized the course of music in the 20th century.
It moves music into a whole other realm. But in reality, the Rite of Spring is a continuation of Russian tradition. If you strip away all of the great dissonances and the unusual rhythmic structures, you'll actually find simple Russian folk melodies going on. It's just that Stravinsky is able to layer them in such a way that created a very new, a very visceral kind of sound. This was, in 1913, extremely aggressive music in a world that wasn't quite ready for it.
Nicholas Roerich's set designs were imaginative landscapes. But his costumes, spun from wool to add heft to their movement, were drawn from his studies of Russian ethnography. Nijinsky's dancers moved in what looked like a frenzy, stamping their feet, pumping their fists in the air, contorting their bodies in visibly uncomfortable ways. One critic described them as the jerky gestures of prehistoric automatons. Others likened Nijinsky's disjointed choreography to post-impressionism and cubism on stage. The movement suited Stravinsky's rhythmically complex, harmonically dissonant score. It was difficult for classically trained dancers, then and now.
You hear the music and you're in a studio and people are whirling around you, these circles, and counterclockwise or this way, and you're like, which way? Clockwise, okay. And how do you feel when you put it's like doing something backwards. If you always do everything with your right hand, you start doing something with your left hand. It's quite challenging.
Diaghilev, aware of the ballet's challenges, had packed the house with rival factions of artists and critics to ensure a ruckus. He got one. Nijinsky, a 1980 film of the dancer's tumultuous relationship with Diaghilev, captures the furore that surrounded the first night.
Well, Diaghilev, of course, always loved a little bit of hoopla, a little bit of a scandal, if you will. It always was good for business. But I think even he was shocked by some of the misbehavior of the audience.
When The Rite of Spring was premiered, the work was presented after Les Sylphides, music by Chopin, very nice and friendly. And now came this rather unusual piece, scored for immense orchestra, probably the largest ever seen in a ballet, that had crazy rhythms and exotic sexual dancing going on the stage. You talk about nights where you'd like to be there? That's one of them.
I think Diaghilev's decision to go forward with The Rite of Spring, which cost a fortune, which entailed numerous rehearsals, musical rehearsals, rehearsals for the dancers, months of rehearsals for the dancers. This showed, you might say, Diaghilev's restiveness, his interest in moving forward, his interest in looking for other forms of dance expression, choreographic expression, musical expression.
In 4 stupendous years, the Ballets Russes had become the cutting edge of the Parisian avant-garde. Painters, writers, and actors flocked to performances. And then, in August of 1913, the unexpected happened. During a tour of South America, Václav Nijinsky married an aspiring ballerina, Romila Dipulski, in Buenos Aires. A furious and deeply wounded Diaghilev dismissed him and rehired Fokine as choreographer. Nijinsky was soon replaced, on stage and in Diaghilev's affections, by the Russian dancer Leonid Massin. Always intense, Nijinsky reacted badly. He began to show signs of the schizophrenia that would lead to a series of institutionalizations and ultimately end his dance career. On June the 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated in Sarajevo. A month later, World War I began. Diaghilev would never return to Russia, and the Ballets Russes never performed there. Throughout the war years, a reduced company toured both North and South America. They played large cities, but they also performed in towns that rarely saw a major European company. The reviews give a sense of how strange the Ballets Russes could seem to audiences in the New World. Nijinsky, partially forgiven, joined the American tour as a visiting artist. Charlie Chaplin was in the audience for the Los Angeles premiere of Afternoon of a Faun in 1916.
I have seen few geniuses in the world, and Nijinsky is one of them. He was hypnotic, godlike, his somberness suggesting moods of other worlds. His every movement was poetry, his every step a flight into strange fancy.
Chaplin's admiration emerged as a playful homage to Afternoon of a Faun in his 1919 film Sunnyside. In a dream sequence, the faun pursues a group of young nymphs. Chaplin imitates Nijinsky's steps in his passionate but equally hopeless pursuit of satisfaction. Chaplin invited Nijinsky to one of his film sets. But the clown was disappointed by the dancer off stage, calling him
a serious man with sad eyes who gave the impression of a monk in civilian clothes.
During the war years, Diaghilev began to commission work from the avant-garde artists in Western Europe. In the years ahead, he would draw on the talents of Jean Cocteau. A writer and artist who sketched members of Diaghilev's circle, including Stravinsky, Cocteau had produced posters for the Ballets Russes performances. In 1917, he wrote the libretto for Parade. His scenario imagined a sideshow on a Paris street touting for customers. With Leonid Massin as the choreographer, Parade was staged in 1917. It borrowed heavily from the music hall tradition of vaudeville. Presented in 3 acts, it featured a Chinese conjurer, played by Massin, 2 acrobats, and a little American girl, based on the film stars Mary Pickford and Pearl White. Erik Satie composed the score. Educated at the Paris Conservatory, Satie was a regular at the Montmartre cabaret Le Chat Noir, and for a while made money as a cabaret pianist. But his music for Parade was firmly in the 20th century. Satie called for the sounds and noises of modernity. Ragtime, foghorns, the clatter of milk bottles, and a typewriter. Diaghilev added another flourish. The sets and costumes were designed by Pablo Picasso, who later married one of the company's dancers, Olga Koklova. The ballet drew on several of Picasso's preoccupations, including the traveling performer, the artist as an outsider, and the fusion of high culture with popular spectacle. His designs and costumes for the sideshow's managers, one American, one French, translated New York skyscrapers and Paris boulevards into Cubist forms. By engaging the most celebrated painter of his generation, Diaghilev bolstered his company's avant-garde credentials. More than 50 years after its debut, Parade was revived by the Joffrey Ballet in 1976 under the guidance of Leonid Massine.
Jerry, you're... That's right. Do it now. Bigger step, my friend. Bigger step. Pop up, pam. That's it.
During The Conjurer, he made that character such an enigma. He was a magician, and then to watch Massine's eyes when he would start to tell you a story, and they would get wider, and he had those big, big eyes. And then he would say things to us like, flex your cheekbones. What does that mean? And so we had to kind of figure, what does that mean? So we kind of came up with flexing your cheekbones.
Sonia Delaunay designed the costumes for a 1918 production of Cleopatra. The sets were designed by her husband, Robert. The following year, Diaghilev, with Stravinsky in tow, arrived unannounced at the home of Henri Matisse. The impresario persuaded the reluctant painter to design the sets and costumes for the Song of the Nightingale. Matisse regretted the decision almost immediately. Writing to his wife, he complained,
"You have no idea what he's like, that man. He's charming and maddening at the same time. He's a real snake who slips through your fingers."
Diaghilev left for London with the company for a series of performances. He demanded that Matisse join him there to start work immediately. The two argued about everything: budgets, material, colours, even the workplace. The 50-year-old painter was put in a loft studio above a basket shop in Covent Garden's fruit and vegetable market. Diaghilev had plates of smoked salmon delivered from a nearby restaurant to keep his painter going. Matisse worked non-stop.
You can't imagine what it's like. The Ballets Russes. There's absolutely no fooling around here. It's an organization where no one thinks about anything but his or her work.
Matisse understood the Ballets Russes aesthetic. He said he viewed the set and costume designs as being like a painting, only with colors that move. The Song of the Nightingale is the story of a dying Chinese emperor restored to life by birdsong. Matisse designed simple tunics with geometric designs for the mourning courtiers and the imperial chamberlains. Despite Diaghilev's estrangement from Russia, he continued to be loyal to Russians. The avant-garde artists Natalia Goncharova and her partner Mikhail Larionov left Moscow, and Diaghilev drew them into his inner circle. Larionov's costumes for Chou, a ballet about a buffoon produced in 1921, merged Cubism with elements of Russian folk culture. Larionov divided the costumes into stylized geometric shapes designed to work in concert with the choreography of Leonid Massine. Massine left the company after Chou, fired by his boss and lover for infidelities with a Ballets Russes dancer. Bronislava Nijinsky, Nijinsky's sister, stepped in as choreographer, producing in 1923 the ballet The Wedding, a grim tale of an arranged marriage set to an austere score by Stravinsky.
It is the story of a marriage, the couple being taken out of their families and social context, put together. But it's not a happy story. It's a story of the disorientation, the ritualized detachment that creates. So it's almost not a ballet. It's almost a ritual in itself. And that's in the music, too. And you hear these powerful Russian Orthodox themes.
Diaghilev never lost sight of the importance of the public relations power of his company's Russianness. When a talented English prodigy, Hilda Munnings, joined the company, he simply changed her stage name to Lydia Sokolova. Lillian Alice Marks became Alicia Markova. For a revival of Firebird in 1926, he turned to Natalia Goncharova for the designs. Her curtain was composed of hundreds of onion domes, evoking Byzantine splendors and the Russian Orthodox past, a world away from the new and discomforting Soviet Union. Goncharova had previously designed costumes for a production of Sadko, a medieval Russian fantasy set in an underwater kingdom. It was extracted from a Rimsky-Korsakov opera. Goncharova's costumes captured the whimsicality of a purely imaginative submarine world. Diaghilev's tireless quest for something new turned the Ballets Russes away from fantasies and myths towards modern life. The Blue Train was named for the overnight train that sped passengers from Paris to the Riviera. The set was a stylized bathing resort with vaguely cubist cabanas. For the costumes, Diaghilev turned to Coco Chanel, who adapted contemporary sportswear for the stage. Bronislava Nijinska incorporated the movements of modern sport and leisure into her choreography. The front cloth, after a painting by Picasso, robust nudes running along a beach, provided a tongue-in-cheek contrast with the androgynous bodies of the Chanel-dressed dancers. George Balanchine arrived from St. Petersburg in 1924. The last of Diaghilev's Ballets Russes choreographers, Balanchine continued the fusion of design and choreography into the late 20s. The Ball, a tale of thwarted romance at a masked ball, opened in May of 1929. Giorgio de Chirico rendered the stage and the dancers as classical ruins. A jumble of eroded arches, overgrown temples, empty pedestals, and a white horse added mystery. De Chirico's sets and costumes were a surreal mix of natural and man-made elements. With arms and legs made of bricks and marble columns, the dancers moved stiffly. A critic noted that it was hard to tell whether the walls are fossilized dancers or the characters are animated stones. Yet again, Diaghilev had proved that ballet could be brought into the vanguard of modern art. 3 weeks later, The Prodigal Son premiered. It was also choreographed by Balanchine. The sets were designed by the painter Georges Rouault. Sergei Prokofiev composed the score. Serge Liffard played the prodigal son, a role also danced by Mikhail Baryshnikov for the New York City Ballet. The story was adapted from the New Testament parable of a rebellious son who squanders his inheritance and returns in shame to his father. Who embraces and forgives him. The tale of temptation, sin, exile, and redemption won glowing reviews. It was an appropriate coda. 3 months after the opening of The Prodigal Son, Diaghilev, now 57, frail and sickly, left Paris. He would die, like his idol Wagner, in Venice. In his lucid moments, he sang arias from Wagner's operas to his companions. His final lead dancer and lover, Serge Liffard. Monsieur Certes, his patron and devoted friend of 20 years. And Coco Chanel. After his death, several of Diaghilev's dancers and choreographers formed new companies, most notably the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo, which resurrected the philosophy and choreography of the company under the guidance of Leonid Massine in 1932. Their touring and teaching activities spread Diaghilev's dream to the United States, South America, and Australia.
Diaghilev created ballet in the West in the 20th century, and he brought an extraordinary revolutionary energy from Russia itself. Without Diaghilev, we probably would not have had the New York City Ballet, the Royal Ballet, even the Paris Opera the way it was.
Bronislava Nijinsky crowned a long career in the 1960s by restaging her works for the Royal Ballet in London. Serge Liffard became the ballet master of the Paris Opera Ballet. Michel Fokine was a leading light in the creation of the American Ballet Theatre. Adolphe Baum, a Ballet Russe dancer, became the first ballet master of the San Francisco Opera Ballet. Georges Balanchine founded the New York City Ballet. Much of the choreography he created for the Ballet Russe, including Apollo, continues to be performed today.
These are the people that seeded ballet in the 20th century.
I think that they left us the art of collaboration, of bringing different artists together in order to make a piece of art. Stravinsky, Fokine, Satie, Picasso, it goes on, Coco Chanel, I mean, it goes on and on and on.
It's a treasure trove. I mean, people just keep coming to ballets that were done in the past and try to interpret them again and again as they were and differently. But it's just like archaeology, you know, just keep digging.
The dream Serge Diaghilev created of dance joining hands with the other creative disciplines to create a total work of art continues to influence world ballet.